Okay, got Urbana, Indiana, Aurora, a lot of people in town, Chicago. Okay. Yeah. Illinois. Okay, so we got a lot of Massachusetts. We got a couple from farther away, different time zone. Yeah, okay. I know we have a few students abroad too. So thank you for joining us from afar, Taiwan. Okay, so we're coming from all over the globe right now. But I wanted to tell you guys before we start a little bit about me. So thank you for joining me from afar. I was born and raised in Oregon and outside of Portland, so I am a Pacific Northwest person at heart. I loved playing sports growing up, so I played basketball, track, and tennis. The best joke I know about the Pacific Northwest came from Jim Gaffigan, and it was that everyone in the Pacific Northwest always looks like they're ready for a spontaneous hike, okay? Because it is like fleece jackets and hiking boots all day. You go to a coffee shop, you never know when a spontaneous hike may break out. Wear the hiking clothes, okay? So love the Pacific Northwest, love hiking. That's why the Columbia store and Nike have thrived there with their world headquarters there. So I played basketball, track, and tennis growing up. I played basketball for 12 years. So in my lectures, you'll actually see a lot of references to basketball and different analogies. I went to college in Washington State, a small school called Whitworth University. University of Illinois is now about 50,000 students. My undergraduate college was 2,400. So it was tiny. We had one quad. We had one sidewalk on that quad called the hello walk, because you'd literally say hello to everyone you knew while you walked to class. So a little bit different experience, but it was less competitive as far as sports go. So I got to play basketball and run track there. So that was really fun for me. And then I took a gap year in my hometown where I worked at a middle school. And then I came to UAUC in 2015 to do my PhD in educational psychology and a focus in developmental sciences. So my research focuses on how do people pursue their goals. You guys all have goals. I can attest, I'm sure you all have goals. How do you pursue them? How do you make sure you succeed at them? Hopefully one of your goals is doing well in this class, right? How are you going to achieve that? That's kind of what I study. I also have a second line of research looking at belonging. How do you perceive you belong in college? How does that look like? What does that look like during a global pandemic? It's a lot different. So during my gap year, I worked at a middle school in a classroom for kids with a special education classroom for kids with behavioral issues. And so these kids were not safe to be in the classroom. So I'm excited to teach this class because of that experience with some atypical youth. I have mentored and babysat kids since I was 11. And for 3 summers in college, I actually worked at a summer camp and worked with probably about 500 kids total. So I have a lot of experience with the youth and children 0 to 13 years old. Okay, so I'm really excited to share that with you. Another thing is the TA Sanchari and I both have 11 semesters between the two of us TAing this class. So we both had a lot of experience with it. We're really excited to share the information with you. So if you have any questions, please let us know, okay? The other thing you might need to know about me is that I'm a huge movie nerd. So you'll get lots of movie nerd references during the lectures. Okay, so let's get to the first movie reference. Take a second to read through this. It's for my Harry Potter fans out there. Okay, so I want to take a pause from class. We are living in an unprecedented situation. This hasn't happened for 100 years. We're living in the midst of a global pandemic. This is big. We're also living where during the summer we saw a lot of racial injustices exposed, things that have been happening in the past and continue to happen. We are seeing the California wildfires have actually displaced some of my friends, and they're currently not living at home right now. And we also have significant unemployment rates, and we also just had this bombing in Beirut. So there's a lot of stuff going on right now, and a lot of stuff directly affecting you as students. This stuff is also disproportionately impacting marginalized communities and some of you guys as well. So what I would say is, number one, while we're going through this semester, please keep in mind your own self-care and your needs. If you guys have seen the Maslow's hierarchy of needs before, it's a great model for how to think about your own self-care. and how you're doing during this time. So I'd encourage, for instance, you know, we're on campus right now, which is great. And it sounds like some of you guys are back on campus. Hopefully we will stay that way. If that changes, things like where you're living, where you're eating, where you're working might change. And that affects some of these basic needs that we see. Okay, so please, during this time, it's crazy, keep in mind your own needs. And that leads to my second point, please communicate with us. We really are here to help you. And we really want you guys to talk with us about what's going on, because if you're facing something that's affecting class, please let us know, and then we can work with you on it. I think the big thing that's hard about being online too is it takes away that initial in-person thing where you could just talk to me after class. So that part is hard too. There's a breakdown in communication now. So please communicate with us, just shoot us an email, and that would be much appreciated. And this class is really touch and go. You know, the plan is to be online synchronous right now. Sunshine and I are assessing, is this the best move forward for our students, for us? So this is really a touch and go semester. So just keep that in mind as we go, okay? Sound good? Okay, cool. So just a quick starting point. Take 2 minutes and reflect based on yourself based on these 3 questions or 4 questions, okay? Okay, so hopefully you had a few minutes to think about that. If you want to, share in the chat some of the words that you chose to describe yourself. Adventurous, loving, fun, good. Passionate. I think for me, I definitely would say goofy is one of mine. I'm pretty goofy. Hardworking, spontaneous, loyal. Yes. Nice, got a lot of different adjectives there. Optimistic. Great, y'all sound great. Awesome. So we have these traits of thinking about ourselves and why these words. Essentially what I'm getting down to with this just refresher on who we are is reminding of us of our own personality. Let's frame this class as thinking about who we are throughout. It's important to reflect in psychology classes. I think it's really fun to think about who you are and how you came to be there. So during this class, I really invite you to reflect on your own personality and how that developed. So really what I'm getting to in this activity is just describe your personality. It might even seem a little reductive saying 3 words. There's a lot to your personality. You're complex, you're an interesting human being. But this is what a lot of psychology personality tests do. The Myers-Briggs, they base on 4 things. They say your personality is these 4 things. So basically, I wanted you to do a personality assessment and then think of the role of social relationships in personality. Do other people understand you the way you understand you? And then finally, I wanted you to think about your belief in whether personality is fixed or malleable. Do you believe that personality changes over time, or are you the same way you were when you were 2? We're going to talk about that today and throughout the semester. So just to give you guys an overview of today, I'm going to give you an overview of the class, some of the things that go into class, what we're going to talk about, grading, all of that. And then we're going to go over the basic foundations for understanding development. This is going to be our framework for the rest of the semester. So let's start with the course overview. So what are we going to talk about? What do you talk about in a personality and social development class? Well, we're going to study individual development from infancy through adolescence, okay? Really right before young adulthood. Most of you guys are in college and you're what we would call young adults, 18 to 24. We're going to really look 2 years old, or 0 to 2 years old, to all the way to about 17 or 18, okay? Some of these things continue through that time, but that's the age we're focusing on. Please note, development does not stop there. We don't magically stop developing when we turn 18 and go to college or go work, you know. We develop throughout our lives. In fact, you'll see in some of the theories we talk about, a lot of psychologists actually just focused on infancy through adolescence. They were like, adults are fine, they'll figure it out, whatever. No, but we are going to focus on these periods in our class. So what this is going to look like is we're going to talk about early social relationships, attachment. Did you have a consistent caregiver in your life? How has that caregiver impacted your relationships with other people? We're also going to talk about personality traits, social cognition, and social behavior. These are things like temperament. Temperament is one of the most genetic pieces of who we are. Sinchari is an expert, awesome individual who studies temperament, and she's going to lecture on that next week. She studies temperament in peers. We're going to talk about emotion regulation and self-regulation. My research falls under self-regulation. So how do you manage who you are? When you're sitting in an actual classroom, in an in-person classroom, usually you don't just scream out randomly or run around the classroom or take your friend's pencil, right? You regulate yourself. You manage your behavior. You have learned that you're supposed to raise your hand when you want to answer a question in class. So how does this impact your success? How does this ability to regulate yourself? Well, we're going to find out in week 5, it impacts you very much. Are babies moral? We're going to ask this question. Are you a moral individual? What is morality? How does that develop? Are we born with this innate ability to know what's right and wrong? Do we always know what's right and wrong now? Then we're going to talk about aggression. Is aggression a positive or negative thing? How does bullying impact who you become? These are all things we're going to talk about in the aggression and bullying lecture. Then, one of my personal favorites, identity development. This is a classic teenage question. Many, many movies are based on this question, on the question of who am I? What is my identity development? Who do I want to be when I grow up? What do I believe? What is my identity? And then we're going to talk about the role of gender and race ethnicity in development. How do my individual characteristics impact how the world sees me? How does this site impact how I develop? How does society view me differently based on these individual factors? And finally, we're going to talk about the context in which we develop, all right? So these are things like families, peers, schools, neighborhoods, social class, and culture. Our development isn't straightforward. It happens in a lot of different bubbles. Our family has a specific culture and a way of operating. We act differently around our families than we do around our peers, especially when we're teenagers. We have neighborhoods that we grew up in that are different from other neighborhoods in our hometown. We all develop in these contexts. So all this to say, development, especially in personality and social development, is complex and all these things interplay together. And we're going to talk about that throughout the semester. All right, so general structure, we're going to have a weekly session. Beforehand, you guys are going to have some readings that are posted on the course website. One weird thing to note is that sometimes the readings are linked through the library. So you have to go to the University of Illinois library page, log in there, and then access the reading. So if you're having trouble, try that. And if that doesn't work, then email us, okay? Sinchari and I. Then we're going to have this lecture. We're going to present new material. We're going to highlight the readings and what they talked about. And then we're going to have group presentations of research articles, okay? And I'll talk about that more in a minute. And then we'll probably throughout the lectures have breakout discussions, in-class activities, polls, commenting in the chat, ways to be involved. Okay, so your grades. So the first 3 darker gray boxes are what undergrads need to focus on. If you're an undergraduate, 75% of your grade is based on 4 online exams. These exams are open book, open note. You'll have a 72-hour period in which to take them. Once you start the exam, you have 2 hours to finish it. All the exams are 25 questions, multiple choice. Okay, cool. And we will not have lecture on the weeks that you have the exam. We'll go into the exam a little bit more and answer questions probably in week 2 or 3. The next part of everyone's grade is 10% based on their group presentation, which I'll go into in a second. And then 15% of your grade is based on class participation. This is being here, attending, video, taking part in the polls, answering in the chat, different things like that, participating and engaging in class material, okay? Now, graduate students, the 4 exams are worth 60% of your grade, and then you additionally have a required paper. We'll talk more about the paper in a little while, but it's 15% of your grade. Finally, everyone has the option to submit an optional extra credit paper for up to 5% extra credit at the end of the semester. We'll talk about that more later. You have a few options for extra credit, but I wanted to make you aware of that now. Okay, group presentation. So what we're gonna do is each week, starting with the attachment week, which is week 3. Sorry, I saw the chat. Each week, 2 groups will present a summary of a different research article on the weekly topic, okay? So I'm gonna put you guys in groups, or you're gonna sign up for groups. I'm gonna email your group with an article, and then in your group, you're going to plan a presentation. In the presentation, you'll summarize the introduction, methods, results, and discussion of that article. So it'll be about a 10 to 12 minute presentation, okay? And then you'll have a couple minutes to answer questions, right? The grading rubric is on Compass now, so you should be able to access that in the group presentation folder. 60% of your grade is based on the presentation, and then 40% is peer evaluation. All that material can be found in the group presentation folder, so feel free to take a look over that, okay? So what I would say is I put a sign-up sheet in that group presentation folder for you to sign up for which week you would like to be in the group presentation. So please sign up by Monday. Just write your name and email. So you'll go to the wiki page, press edit, and then sign your name in whichever topic is most interesting to you. Okay, I would also double check your schedules, make sure that's a good week for you. Okay. Readings from the optional textbooks. If those are assigned readings for that week, a couple of the, like one chapter from The Social Animal is assigned in week 5, that will be a part of the exam. You sign up for one presentation, yes. So you're just gonna present in the group once. All right, any other questions? Okay. So I would like to introduce you to your amazing TA, Sanchari. She's one of my favorite people. She also TA'd this class for 2.5 years, and so she's an expert. So Sanchari, do you want to introduce yourself really quick?
Yeah, you're one of my favorite people too. Hi everyone, my name is Sanchari. As Bethany said, we just have a lot of semesters in between us TAing this class, so hopefully we're really hoping that this is going to be a fun class for all of you and for us as well this semester, even though we are living in wild times right now. I am also a doctoral student in educational psychology. My research is with preschoolers and looking at how their temperament and peer engagement is related, and kind of using a cultural lens to look at the whole situation. So I will be doing a few of the classes like temperament and peer relations, given that those are things I study. And yeah, so as you can see, my office hours are Wednesdays and Fridays from 12 to 1:30. It is a lot easier if you go on Calendly and just book an appointment, just so that I know who's coming in when, and I can prepare for it, especially if you send me an email if you have any particular questions you think you're going to be going over at that time. And yeah, just any questions you have, also email me whenever you need to. I'm pretty much always on email, so you should get a reply pretty quickly. If I do not reply to you within, I don't know, like 24 hours or something, just send me a reminder, because it will most probably not happen, but if it does, just send me a reminder. And yeah, hopefully we are gonna have a really fun semester.
Thanks, Sanchari. Yeah, I hope so too. All right, so that's the information about class. Like I said, we'll be talking more about the exams and the papers in coming weeks. But if you have any other questions on the grading or anything like that, feel free to shoot us an email, set up a Calendly appointment. I also have set up a Calendly schedule so you can sign up for office hours in there. Okay, so now let's get into the foundations of understanding development. Well, first, we're going to talk about theories of socialization, but I want to define our terms first. So personality refers to individual differences in characteristic patterns of thinking, feeling, and behavior. Essentially, personality are the patterns in which you live, your consistency, related to the way you think, feel, and behave. It's similar to character, but your character is more reserved. It's not something people see initially. Personality is very visual. It's your consistent responses to your environment. So an interesting question we're going to keep asking is your personality fixed or malleable? Now, social development. Social development is defined as the gradual acquisition of certain skills, attitudes, relationships, and behavior that enable the individual to interact with others and to function as a member of society. So this is how society helps shape you, the society in your home, in your peer group, in our school at University of Illinois. So how does your social environment impact your development? The social world is huge. It has all these different spheres. So it's really how society forms your development. So how are we socialized? How do we become who we are? How does society mold us towards one path and away from others? And what influences this? Comment in the chat really quick. How did one meaningful person in your life socialize you? So my example would be, my parents taught me I really need to say please and thank you. Yeah, okay. That was not squishing the top of a loaf of bread. My husband and I both make bread, so I can really appreciate that one. Prioritizing relationships with others, be respectful towards others, respect your elders, be appreciative, be respectful. I see a lot of parent influence. We can think about this a lot when we go through the parenting lecture. Be respectful, advocate for your culture, absolutely. Be kind, yeah. So it goes to add things attributes we should have, like be respectful, be kind, be courteous, and also specific things of how you present yourself, hardworking, dedicated, work on your studies, be appropriate, yeah. So a lot of these, what I characterize a lot of these as is these social skills that we develop to be members of society. So there are different theories about how we're socialized. How does this happen? And we're going to review some of those theories. So first, let's define socialization, the process by which individuals are taught the skills, behaviors, values that are necessary to function appropriately in society. It's how we learn to function in society. The goals of this socialization are to instill character or grit, whatever that means. That is different depending on the context. But it could be your internal sense of work ethic, your morality that aligns with the society you're in. If you see $100 bill on the sidewalk, how do you react? Is that based on your character? Is that a moral issue? Another piece of the puzzle is to instill etiquette. Another goal is to instill that. And like I was talking about, say please and thank you. A lot of you guys said help without being asked. Be patient, be kind, and instilling social etiquette. Social etiquette is very, very adaptive. It's very helpful for us to give etiquette in society and to make people feel respected. That's another goal. Another goal is how to navigate social situations. You guys are existing in many different social events. You have family gatherings. You might have been living at home during this past time during the pandemic. and you have to learn how to navigate that space, how to live adaptively with others. Now you might be back on campus. That's a different social situation. You have a whole dorm potentially full of people that you're interacting with, or just people that you see on campus that you're interacting with. And then there are social situations like parties, right? You act differently at a party than you do at a family gathering, I would say. And another way to think about that is we've been socialized to navigate a different social situation now. I stood in line on Monday wearing a mask 6 feet away from the person in front of me and behind me. I wouldn't have done that 8 months ago. But we've been socialized and told this is a required part of our society right now because of the pandemic. So it's a different social situation than it was 6 or 8 months ago. Okay, so how does this develop? Socialization can be a product of reinforcement. So we reinforce in children the desired behaviors and punish undesired behaviors. This often happens by caregivers, other key adults, and society in general. In this way, society directs children away from one path and towards another. So an example of this would be social norms. So one is sharing is caring. I'm sure a lot of you guys heard this old adage in preschool. Sharing is caring. You need to share your toys. When I would share with individuals, I would get positive verbal rewards, even in some cases, stickers from my teachers, right? The reason I said destruction of property is not is because when I was 5, I was very angry at my brother, and I only have one brother. It's me and my brother. And I decided to sneak into his room and completely wreck it. Just throw everything on the floor. It was really bad. And of course, my 5-year-old mind was like, my mom won't know it's me. And of course, the first thing she did was say, okay, Andrew didn't wreck his own room. Bethany, did you wreck his room? And I, of course, said yes. And I got grounded. And I specifically remember my brother being able to watch a movie that night, and I didn't get a watch because I was grounded. So my mom punished the undesired behavior of destroying my brother's room. All right, and we see this in society. In preschools, we also see the charts, like the cloud weather charts that tell you how your day's going. So if you're having a really good day, you're having a sunny day, and the teachers give you encouraging statements and they move your thing to the sunny day. If you misbehave, they move you down to the rainy day, and eventually you reach the thunderstorm. So any of those incentive charts you see is designed to socialize through reinforcement, okay? One of the problems with this idea is that it doesn't give greater importance to habits learned earlier versus later. Does it matter if these are reinforced when you're a preschooler or when you're a teenager? For me personally, I was a B average student until I hit my junior year in college and got into my psychology classes and fell in love with them. Then I became a much better student. That happened when I was later, and it happened through reinforcement from my teachers or professors who were telling me, hey, you can do this. Another problem with this theory is that your caregiver can actually reinforce negative behaviors. Think of aggression. If you've seen Breakfast Club, which is a fantastic movie, totally goes into all the identity development stuff. We'll talk about it in that lecture. One of the characters, Andrew, is an athletic boy who decided to pick on a peer. He basically said, oh, my dad is always talking about the good old days when he was in high school and how he would bully people. And so I felt like I should bully this person for his approval. And he says that his dad was actually very happy he bullied this person. In this case, the caregiver is reinforcing aggression in the child or in the adolescent. This can happen with other negative behaviors too, or like anxiety or being messy in your house, in your living space. And then you go to college and your roommates might be like, I like living in a clean space. A lot of these different things. So socialization happens because we reinforce desired behaviors and punish undesired behaviors. Another theory talks about socialization as a product of impulse control. All right, so maybe what happens is that it's our caregiver's responsibility when we're really young to manage our impulses. You can see this in infants cry, and their caregiver says, I need to help them manage that crying. Is their diaper dirty? Do they need to be fed? Do I just need to rock them? They find a way to control that impulsive crying, essentially. And then you get into later years and it's your responsibility to control that impulse in yourself. When you're a toddler, if you cry out, your parent or caregiver will help you with that, but they also expect you, they say, I'm so sorry you're feeling this way, but expect the child to calm down more. And then finally, when you're a college student, like you guys, and you're in class, you're probably not going to throw a tantrum in class. You're in charge of controlling that impulse in yourself. Likewise, you probably are not going to bring your parent or caregiver with you to class to say, please manage my tantrums for me as if I was a baby. That probably would not work. Now, this also works for other areas like sharing toys. Encourage, don't steal your friends' toys. It also works. One of the ways I remember as a child having to learn to control my impulses was asking a woman if she was pregnant when I was very young. Okay. Another style is socialization as a product of parenting style. So there are a lot of theories on parenting, and we're going to go over these in the parenting lecture. Often these styles are rated on scales of warmth, how warm or your parents are to you, and control, how controlling are they over you. So do they warmth as in, do they respond to your emotional needs? Do they show you love and care, or do they not? And then control as in, do they manage your behavior and what you do? Do they do that to an extreme? Do they not control what you do and let you just do whatever you like? All right. And so perhaps that style of parenting impacts how you develop those desired behaviors, skills, and values in society. So think of these questions. Were your parents social? Did they take you places all the time to be with friends and you needed to learn how to relax and be around people all the time? Maybe that could affect how much you hang out with friends now. Were your parents very, very strict with you? Does that affect how you do in school, your relationship with others? So socialization as a product of parenting style. And then we're also another theory is socialization as a product of bidirectional relationships. This is what I'll tell you right now. Write the word bidirectional in your notebook or in your notes. The reason being bidirectional means that what factor A affects factor B, and at the same time, factor B affects factor A. So what this means is that children influence their parents' socialization practices, and then in turn, those socialization practices affect how children develop behaviors, skills, and values. So I talked earlier about babies crying. So when a baby cries, the parent, is their diaper dirty? Do they need food? Do they need to be held? In this way, the parent does something to help manage the child, to help them calm down, right? But couldn't you argue that by crying, the baby is also controlling the parent and predicting what the parent does? The baby is teaching the parent, when I cry, you need to respond to me. So there's a relationship there. What this might look like for children or toddlers or preschoolers is that children will tell their parents, I want to hang out with these friends, and I might want to engage in a relationship like this. Can this friend come over to play? You're playing an active role in your own development, and then the parents respond to that and say yes or no, and in turn affect your socialization and development by that relationship with that peer. Okay, so in this model, children play a direct role in their own development and their own socialization. They are active agents, okay? And then additionally, you guys can see my PowerPoint, right? Can you put yes in the window if you just see the full PowerPoint? Not the presentation window? Okay, thank you. Just checking. My computer did something weird. Oh, first day of class, guys. I'm sure you're getting a lot of this week, huh? Okay, so socialization as a product of context. Thank you all. Socialization as a product of context. Where are you? The socialization might depend on your setting, circumstance, or interaction. So one of the classic stories is, how do you handle a toddler crying in the grocery store, right? If you're in the supermarket. Parents might handle that situation of a tantrum very differently in a market than at home. At home, you could say, I need to let the child work this out, I'm going to ignore them. But in a social setting, like a market, you have other people around and you get embarrassed. So parents might respond differently depending on the setting you're in. You might even, as the child, respond differently depending on with your friends or with your family. It might be different based on whether I'm on the West Coast or in Illinois. The contexts are a little bit different. All right, so perhaps socialization occurs and is impacted by the context you are in. Okay, the next theory is maybe socialization is a product of your culture. We have different cultural values that influences what socialization occurs and what is valued in that culture. We have continents with countries, with regions, states, counties, cities, neighborhood, different households. There are many different cultures that value different things. And so this is really something that encompasses a lot of socialization. What do we value socializing kids with? This can really be seen in how we look at emotions. There are 5 foundational emotions and they exist in all cultures. We know these, but how they are expressed and interpreted varies across different cultures. One of the previous instructors of this class used to be a consultant in Tajikistan. The reason she was an expert on emotions. The reason she was hired was because in Tajikistan, the only socially acceptable emotion to express was anger. Not joy or fear or anything like that. It was just anger. And what occurred was the children from Tajikistan would go to other nations for work and they would be struggling professionally because they did not have that social relationship with their peers where they understood how to express different emotions. So they brought in this consultant to help them work on social emotional learning within their school context. Now you look at the context of America. Anger looks very different in America. It's not an emotion that we necessarily value as showing as much. Now this is different based on your culture within America. In the culture I grew up in, I would argue the only socially acceptable form of anger to show was passive-aggressive anger. And that's not a healthy form of anger, but it's the one that was accepted in my society. And then the context in which I grew up and the culture in which I grew up. So one of the most important parts of socialization is the culture in which you are raised and what it values. All right, so that's a lot of theory all at once about how we're socialized. What are the different roles here? Is it parents? Is it reinforcement? All of these things. The take-home message from all of this is that socialization is the product of a variety of processes that we'll revisit throughout the semester. It's probably a mix of all of these things. All of these things contribute to how you are, and the interaction between these things do. So socialization is very, very complex. I want you to keep a question in mind. How do our current circumstances influence socialization? As I said, today we're facing COVID-19, racial injustices, the bombing in Lebanon, wildfires. How will this impact children's socialization? Think about the fact that for the first time in a very, very long time, children are learning online. Yesterday, my really good friends who have 4 children aged 6 to 14 started online learning. So how does that affect your socialization if you're learning at home with your peers versus being in a classroom? In addition, this crisis is disproportionately impacting marginalized communities. How will it significantly affect the socialization of those children and those adolescents? Another thing I like to think about is how will this affect you, college students, in asking the big questions? When I went to college, I experienced college as a place where I started thinking about the world and how it works. You guys are in an amazing time in your life, and you're also experiencing something very, very unique. How will that affect your socialization? How does social distancing affect that in college? You are able to be on the college campus right now. That may not continue through the whole semester compared to other universities around the United States where everyone's online. So during a time that's really important in your guys' life as well, you're experiencing a different socialization. So a few things to keep in mind as we move forward, okay? All right. Now we're gonna go into continuity versus discontinuity. Okay, do we believe that personality is a continuous variable or do we believe it's discontinuous? So I would like you guys to fill out a poll really quick. Do people change over time? Okay, waiting on a few more, got most. Okay, so I'll show you guys. So let's see, about 71% of you guys said yes, people definitely change over time. And then the other people said it depends, about 29%. It depends on who they are, circumstance, we'll talk about that more. Interestingly, no one said, no, you do not change over time. Okay. So let's talk about continuity versus discontinuity. Here we go. So continuity essentially is, does a personality trait stay consistent across time? Do you get this when you're a child and it stays the same across your entire life? What that would mean for development is that development is a continuous and cumulative process. It's like that slow gradient upward. It's just this slow move towards the top. Development stays very consistent and very linear across that. In contrast, a good example of this would be me as a child. When I was a child, generally across my development, I stayed relatively easygoing. You know, we all go through our adolescent rebellious phase, but I generally stayed easygoing across my younger years, and it was pretty continuous and consistent. Now, discontinuity. So this is when a personality trait might disappear or appear by adulthood. So maybe you have a personality trait that you didn't have as a child, and now it is that you're a young adult, you have this trait. Or maybe you had something when you were younger that's now gone, right? So in this case, development is a series of distinct stages. This is really good for Erikson. If you've studied Erikson's model, he believes every stage of development is based on a crisis we face. So it's not this linear thing, it's based on stages that we work through. To contrast my example, my husband actually was a very, very aggressive child. When he was really, really young, he got in, not fights, but he messed with peers. He had some really concerning behavior and was just really aggressive. Well, he was aggressive, yeah. And so his dad said, you know what? I'm gonna intervene on this. I'm gonna hang out with this kid as much as possible. And within a year, John was more easygoing. And he's been easygoing since he was about 5 years old. But he went through this phase at 2 to 3 years old where he was really, really aggressive. And that's not present anymore. So you see these two different examples. So like a good researcher, Caspy said, why don't I test this idea? Are personality traits like temperament, do they have a long-term effect on your development? Caspy was really interested in whether personality continues from when you're 2 to 3 years old to 18 to 21. So imagine someone surveying you when you were 2 to 3 years old and now coming back to your age now and saying, hey, I want to check in with you, have you take some scales and see it when you were 2 years old if it's related to who you are now. Okay? This idea would support the idea that we should intervene early in children's lives, right? So if you say that personality is more rigid, it stays the same, we want to intervene with these kids earlier because it'll have the biggest effect when they're older. It won't matter if we intervene when they're teenagers, all right? So I will tell you, like all people, researchers also kind of have like fan moments where they're super fans of something. I'll be honest, I'm a super fan of this study. It was really, really well done, and it's really interesting. So in general, CASPI sought to examine whether temperament was that aspect of personality was related to development. Okay, so what this brings us to is the Dunedin study. This was a huge study, 1,000 kids. They had perinatal data through age 21. So perinatal data is data that was collected before the baby was even born. They started surveying the mothers to ask them about themselves. And it was very intensive data. Across 21 years, they collected a lot of data from these kids. All right. So there are some real strengths to this study. The first is that it's a perspective and longitudinal study. Even when talking to these parents before their children were born, they had the plan to ask these children about themselves when they're 21 years down the road. So having a 21-year vision. And this was a longitudinal research, meaning they followed the same children across time. A lot of research will use cross-sectional studies, which means you take kids in 5th grade and then you take kids in 7th grade and you say, they're not the same kids, but I can predict 7th grade outcomes from what you're doing in 5th grade. But this study is really strong because it uses the same kids over time. So you can say they're definitely related. The study was also, I do not like this word, epidemiological, there we go, study of a birth cohort. So it's really the main goal of this study was to look at the causes and consequences of health patterns in a specific population. So the study was looking at something bigger than just this one. Another strength was minimal attrition. For all you researchers out there, you know the 97% retention is amazing. This means that 90% of the kids they recruited when they weren't even born stayed in the study when they were 21 years old. That's incredible. As a researcher, I would be thrilled if I had that type of retention, all right? And then the study was large enough to control for confounding factors. Confounding factors are usually variables that affect what you're looking at. So for instance, we know that mother's education is one of the strongest predictors of child outcomes. So how educated your mother is predicts these things. So we usually control for that, or we keep that into consideration when we do these kind of studies. So these are the advantages of this particular study. Now looking honestly, it looks like 72 to 94 was a long time ago. Okay, let's take a 10-minute break. It's been about 50 minutes of lecture. So take 10 minutes and then we'll come back together, okay? What did CASPI examine? We talked about temperament, and I mentioned that temperament is one of the most biological things about us and one of the most consistent things about us. So what they did in their study was they brought in these 1,000 children at different times, not all at once, and interviewed them basically for 90 minutes. And in that time, they assessed their lack of control, how much they approach individuals, and their sluggishness to assess these factors. So what they did was they measured those on a continuum, put them all together, and moved the kids into different temperament categories, okay? So they said these are the 5 that kind of came out of the 1,000 kids. They said if we could bring together temperament, these are the 5 kind of patterns we saw. And the 3 they used for this study are well-adjusted, under control, and inhibited. Now you may notice those percentages don't necessarily add up to 100%. That's because all the kids couldn't necessarily fit into these 5 categories. A few kids did not. So that's why it doesn't add up to 100. The well-adjusted kids they found were capable of self-control when they were required to. These kids were really self-confident around strangers, around people they knew. And they didn't become unduly upset when confronting new people and situations. So they didn't get fearful or really, really upset when they encountered a stranger or a new situation. In contrast, and that we'll see with the well-adjusted actually, it is 40% of the sample. So a majority of the sample, this is more normative, or a majority of us would fall into this well-adjusted category. Now in contrast, the under-controlled kids, about 10% of the sample, these kids were more impulsive, they were restless, they were really distractible across those 90 minutes. And they were really had a wide range of emotional responses. Their responses were way stronger, okay? These kids were a little more restless, a little more aggressive, a little bit more impulsive. And then you have the inhibited group, which is about 8% of the sample. These kids are the kind of the classic you'd think of more shy. They were socially reticent, they were fearful, and easily upset by the presence of strangers, okay? So that was the predictor variable. They said at 2 years old, we want to see temperament. What outcomes did they consider? Well, they came back when the kids were 18 years old and had them fill out personality profiles. They also looked at their relationship with other people, how romantic relationships, social relationships at 21. And then they also looked at psychiatric disorders and criminal behavior at age 21. Okay, so this is a very long-term study. All right, what they found. You can see across here, we have 3 different groups. We have the under-controlled, we have the inhibited, and the well-adjusted kids. In these models, they were comparing the inhibited and under-controlled kids to the well-adjusted kids, okay? So they found that the under-controlled group, in comparison with the well-adjusted kids, had much lower self-control and much lower harm avoidance than the well-adjusted kids and the inhibited kids. So this means they found that these kids weren't necessarily avoiding harm and weren't controlling themselves as well. You can contrast this with the inhibited kids, who are way more avoidant of harm and have much more self-control, even so compared to the well-adjusted kids. And you think about anxiety and shyness in those inhibited kids being overly self-controlled and being very harm avoidant kind of makes sense. Okay, you can also see, let's see if I have, yes, okay. So you can also see in the under-controlled kids, they were much more aggressive than both the inhibited and well-adjusted kids. They experienced much more alienation, they were less social, and they had a higher stress reaction. So when they were stressed out, their reaction was way higher compared to the inhibited and well-adjusted kids. And then interestingly, you'll see that the inhibited kids experience lower achievement than both the under-controlled and well-adjusted kids. Okay, and they had much lower social potency. All right, so there's some personality things. Let's talk about their interpersonal relations, okay? So you'll see that the under-control kid experienced much lower household relations. So whoever was in their household, they had rated their relationships as much poorer with those people. Interestingly, that also happened with the inhibited a little bit. You'll see their relationship quality is significantly lower than the inhibited and well-adjusted kids, again, at age 21, related to when they're 2 years old. So material support, you'll see all of these factors, mentorship, companionship, and emotional support, much lower in both compared to the well-adjusted group. So what these are really showing us is in interpersonal relations and the personality stuff, the well-adjusted kids were doing much better than the under-controlled and inhibited kids. All right, when we go to mood disorders, that we look at the base rate right here, these 2 base rates are the number of cases of that disease existing in the population divided by the total population. So it sounds ridiculous, but they took the 1,000 kids, they saw how many individuals have these mood disorders, and then they divided that number by the total population. So basically what this tells us is that the inhibited INH kids were much more likely to have depression than the well-adjusted kids. And they were over that threshold where the inhibited kids had more depression than kids in the other factors. And same with the under-controlled. This was not, the mania part right here was not actually run. This was just to show you the numbers, but they didn't have any inhibited kids in the mania category. This is antisocial personality disorder. We see the under-controlled at age 21 had significantly higher percentage of that. And then alcohol dependence in the under-controlled and inhibited was higher in these youth, alcohol dependence, than well-adjusted. Okay? And then criminal offenses in the under-controlled was higher as well, compared to well-adjusted and inhibited. So the verdict is, there is evidence that there is continuity in these temperament traits from childhood to young adulthood. So they were able to predict these things. This was a groundbreaking, huge study. But here's the thing. Temperament is definitely one of the most consistent traits we have. There's a lot of evidence backing that up. It's very biological. one of the things they theorized at the end was, well, there's evidence that it's also not continuous in other studies. Maybe it's the relationship between your personality and the environment you're in. Okay, so perhaps continuity occurs because you have personality characteristics and you invoke those personality characteristics on your environment, right? And then your environment responds. If your environment responds the same way all the time, you're gonna stay the same way. So that's essentially what this is saying, is that your environment stays the same and your personality stays the same, which makes you continuous, right? But what if the environment changes? And this is the basis for a lot of interventions, saying, okay, there's a personality characteristic. Why don't we change the environment to affect that? So what they didn't look at in this study was, did their environment change at all across this time? What did that look like? So perhaps it's a function of that. So we'll revisit this idea throughout the semester. All right, so that's continuity versus discontinuity. Let's talk about genes and environment. All right, this is the classic nature versus nurture thing. If you're a psychology major, I bet you've heard nature versus nurture a bazillion times. So comment in the chat. Do you believe you are more of your genes, your environment, or a mix of both? Both? I'm seeing a couple different things, a lot of both. Okay, yeah, so the consensus generally is both. We're gonna go over some theories about gene and environment interaction, because there are people who believe it's just one or the other. And that's what we're gonna look at, the multiple camps. Okay, so this camp, genetical essentialism, says genes are unchangeable. We are our genes. Our behavior, our personality, our intelligence is all determined by our DNA, just like your hair or eye color would be as well, okay? So your environment really doesn't have any role to play here. It doesn't matter what your environment is for your personality, for your social development. It's all your genes. It's all what your parents or biological parents gave you at the time. And your genes determine everything. One of the weird advantages of this is like, okay, psychologists are done. We can't do anything. We're in the environment. We don't need to understand differences. It's all based on your genes. We don't need to think about the environment at all. But the dangerous problem with this is that genes become endowed with this mystical ability to explain everything about you and about your society, about your culture, and about certain groups compared to other groups, right? So this argument has been used for manifest destiny, for things like that, right? Is the idea that some genes are superior. I just have great genes, that's unchangeable. This is the way it is, all right? We'll talk in the parenting lecture about a theorist called Harris who had 2 children, and her 2 children were different. So she said, I raised them in the same environment. Therefore, they must be different because of their genes. And that was her whole theory, and she wrote a book about it. We'll talk about that later. All right, now on the other side, there's genetic determinism, which says, no, I don't know. I think it's a mix of nature and nurture. It's a mix of our genes working in combination with our environment to determine an individual's observable traits, right? So our behavior, personality, intelligence is only partially determined by our DNA. Where you grew up matters. Who your caregivers were matter. The environment matters. So the idea that stems out of this is with the right environment, these traits can be improved upon. Now, the advantage of this is that your environment matters. We can help shape people's personality, behavior, and intelligence for the better. So what your parents did really matter for who you became. Good job, caregivers. The problem is that the idea that humans can be improved takes off, at least temporarily. The idea that we can provide an environment that helps people grow takes off. And this has also been used for a source of oppression and different things like this. This is genetic determinism as works, the black-white test score gap, bell curve, intelligence. If you have not seen this movie, I highly recommend it. It's an older movie from the 90s that I watched as a kid, and it's about a few Aboriginal girls in Australia. And the premise was that if basically they were trying to have white individuals oppress Aboriginal people and have children with them, so that they had biracial children, and then those children were forced to marry and be with white individuals and breed people out. It's the same idea as Braveheart, but it's an incredible story about these girls running away and running 1,500 miles away to their family. So if you haven't seen it, fantastic movie. Again, my super nerd, movie nerd self coming out. Okay, keep in mind though, one of the strongest predictors of a child's verbal skills is how much their parents talk to them. This was a huge study published by Hart and Risley in 1995, exploring how often words are spoken to youth. Okay, so they said when kids are really, really young, how much does their family speak to them? And it was directly related to their verbal development. Verbally skilled children tend to do better in school and are more likely to attend to college, and in turn, they are more likely to get jobs. The most recent evidence has also found in this study that the quality of education given by parents is crucial. How much your parents cared about education and how much effort they put into your education really, really matters for how you developed. So clearly there are other environmental factors that really relate to your outcomes. So in the end, environment matters. The environment you were raised in matters. Who talks to you matters. All right, so this is a good model. Gottlieb's emergent model is saying, okay, so we have these genes, we have this environment, how does this all intersect? How do they affect each other? And this was a really good model for looking at these relationships. Basically, the idea is your baseline is you have genetic activity. This genetic activity impacts your neural activity right here, which is what's going on in your brain. What's going on in your brain, the neural activity affects your behavior. All right, so it affects what you do on a daily basis. And then that you in turn affect your environment, right? Your physical environment, your social environment, your cultural environment. But what we have to understand is that that environment you're in also affects your behavior, right? So again, if you're at University of Illinois, you probably behave differently than a professional setting at work or perhaps at home, right? So that affects your behavior. Your behavior affects your neural activity, which then affects your genetic activity. So Gottlieb's theory was that it's this top-down or bidirectional effect where each piece of you affects the other, right? And you develop over time. So these are constantly happening. When you're a baby, your genetics affect your neural activity, which affects your behavior, but the way your mom or caregiver treats you affects your behavior, which affects your neural development and genetic activity. So it's really a constantly going back and forth relationship in these arrows, okay? So let's look at some research on this, okay? Gene by environment, the case of the DRD4. So basically, people wanted to look at maladjustment in children. And there's a lot of evidence that this one gene, right here, this one, the 7 repeat, is related to maladjustment across the lifespan. So they can ask someone, they've found that children who have this gene are more likely to be aggressive and have externalizing behavior issues. They also found it's related to novelty seeking and substance abuse in adults, all right? Just having this gene. At the same time, there's the environmental piece of this. We also know that insensitive or harsh parenting is related to maladjustment. So children whose parents are less sensitive during early childhood and across their development tend to exhibit more behavior issues, fewer social skills, and higher levels of antisocial behavior. So what we see is the insensitive is like, you can think of it as responding and emotional support. So do your parents respond to you when you cry or are upset across your lifespan? Do they support you? Do they provide safe environments for you? Or do they not? So we know that insensitive parenting or harsh parenting is related to maladjustment across the lifespan. So this researcher Beckerman's, Cranenberg, looked at, is there an interaction? So we see that some kids who have harsh parenting have negative outcomes, but some don't. And we also see some kids with these genes have harsh outcomes, but some don't. So is there an interaction between the two? Does your genes matter in your environment? So are some children more susceptible to insensitive parenting because they have this gene or don't have this gene? So their research question was, do externalizing behaviors in preschool derive from the combination of genes and insensitive parenting? Okay, so they looked at 47 10-month-olds, about half male, with a twin sibling. So this is a twin study. Note that most of the sample was middle class, all right? So predictors in this study was maternal sensitivity. So that was that looking at sensitive versus insensitive. So they had them come into a lab and hang out with their mom, with each twin, and see, okay, did they respond to their children? Were they sensitive to their children? And then they looked at the cell collection, cheek cell collections, to see if kids had this gene or did not have this gene. The outcome they examined was externalizing behavior, with the child behavior checklist. So they had the mother fill out questions about how their child acts related to externalizing behavior. Okay, and this is what they found. They found that, so the 7 minus means they did not have the gene. The 7 plus right here means they did have the gene. So what they found was that children with the gene, when their parents were really sensitive to their needs, they responded to their children when they were upset, they gave them emotional support and safe spaces. They were less aggressive, they had fewer externalizing behaviors, right? But if their parents were low sensitivity, they didn't respond to them, they didn't create that environment, the kids had much higher externalizing issues in the presence of the gene. You'll notice if they did not have the gene, parenting was irrelevant, right? These kids were about the same on externalizing. The parenting didn't play a huge role. They ran this again and found the same line of results for oppositional behavior, for aggression, and they replicated across the other twin in the sample, right? So they looked at the other twin, all right? Okay, any questions on that? Okay. So generally, that there is different susceptibility, that some kids are genetically more at risk in low support versus high support environments, right? So some kids, depending on their genes, might be more susceptible to the environment. So we are seeing that gene-environment interaction. Yes, so we're likely a product of gene by environment interactions in our lives. And we'll look at this again throughout the semester. Okay, so we've gone through each of these. Now we're going to talk about one of my favorite developmental models, the ecological context model of development. So we need to understand how this all goes together. If we're a product of genes by environment interaction, how does that intersect? Can we create a model of that development? And that's what the ecological context model essentially did. It placing behavior in context is critical. It said that we exist in all these different contexts, and putting those together and understanding child's behavior that way is really, really important. Interestingly, this argues that behavior does not come from the individual, but it comes from the environment. Your caregivers, your cultures, your friends elicit behavior that results in socialization. The person does not necessarily give that behavior. So one important thing to note about this model was they didn't say the environment matters. They said the child's perception of the environment matters. So I don't know if any of you guys had this experience, but when I was younger and I would go to school or something, you know, there was one hallway that was like really big and dark and scary. It was really freaky. And I didn't like walking down this hallway. And then of course you visit the hallway 15 years later, it's like, okay, it's a normal hallway, right? It's not scary anymore. We have things as a kid that were looked different than they do now. So that it kind of represents this idea that environments look specific to the individual, just how you'll perceive an environment or a situation differently than your friend. So what really matters is how the individual perceives their environment, right? So I'll give you a second to read through this quote from Bronfenbrenner. All right, so that's Bronfenbrenner. Okay, so really quick, those are all of them. I'm gonna go through them in the model. These will be on your slides though, so you can do them, but it's easier if I show you this. So we have the individual. The individual right there. These are gonna go out in ripples. The closest circles affect the person the most directly, all right? So Bronfenbrenner said there is the individual, and they directly live in the microsystem. A microsystem are structures the child has direct contact with, all right? So this is your family. These are peers, your school, health services, and your church. These are individuals that the child directly responds to, interacts with, and who really, really channels their development. These are really the direct contributors to their development, all right? Next, we have the mesosystem. The mesosystem are the connections between factors in that microsystem. So this is like the relationship between families and schools. So I mentioned that I have some friends who have young kids. The mesosystem is where their parents talk to the school about that child. It's about the school and parent working together to help that child, right? To say, okay, we're gonna do online learning this fall. So you need to come to the school to get a laptop and headphones for your child to attend first grade, right? It's also the relationships between peers in school. Right now, the kids are not in school and not with their peers. School is affecting their relationships, their social relationships. So the mesosystem is the connections between each of those factors in the microsystem and how that relates to the child. Now we get to the exosystem. The exosystem are settings that do not directly involve the developing person, but in which events occur that affect or affected by the individual. All right, so these aren't some things you always have direct contact with, but that are a huge part of your life. So neighborhoods, the neighborhood you grew up in. Do you have a neighborhood watch? Is your neighborhood patrolled by police officers? Who lives in your neighborhood? These factors, what's the income level of your neighborhood? This all affects the child. And then you look at mass media. This really should say also social media. Your parents' conversations about you on social media affect your development. For instance, if your caregiver and your aunt get in a huge argument and don't talk anymore, then you, the individual, may not see your aunt for a long time, right? So these things happening in social media might affect you as an individual in your relationships directly, right? This is also social services. One thing that what services are available to you to go to. We have McKinley Health Center. A big one we're experiencing right now is testing, rapid testing. We have this available to us through the university, right? So it's something that we experience where others are not right now. So you have these places in the exosystem that are really impacting the individual in a more indirect way. And then you have the macro system. The macro system are the attitudes and ideologies of your culture. So these are the really big social, cultural belief systems that exist in your society. And they affect every level of this circle, of this context model. What your society values will affect your neighborhoods and social media and family, right? And the intersections between family and school. For instance, in American society, We highly value extroversion. So extroverted people tend to get promotions, do better in jobs, and make more friends. We live in an extroverted society, basically. The other thing we value is individualism. We value individual accomplishments. And we post those on social media. We talk to family about them. These are values that affect every single level of these circles. All right? So as you see, the black arrows represent these attitudes and ideologies from the macro system affecting every level. Okay, the last one is called the chrono system. And this is changes to an individual or environment over time. So these are changes that occur across your development. Okay, so all of this stuff is occurring across time as you develop. All right, so we're gonna move to a breakout room activity. So Sanchari, could you grab the group activity possibly? Sanchari?
Yeah, do you want me to put it in the chat?
Yeah, if you wouldn't mind, that'd be great.
Sure.
Okay, so what we're gonna do is we're gonna go into breakout rooms and you'll have a prompt on the sheet. It'll have this model, but I want you to think about how COVID-19 is affecting individual development at each of these levels, okay? So you're gonna get in a group, identify a leader and fill out this form. Make sure you get everyone's names on the form and take about, we're gonna take 15 minutes. Yeah, 15 minutes till 4:45. Talk about how COVID-19 affects these different systems and in what ways, okay? So I'll call you back together at 4:45. Okay.
Is the file visible to everyone? I just put it in the chat.
Okay. Yeah, can everyone see the file? Okay. All right, here we go. So just to summarize, oh, and really quick, make sure that whoever your group leader was or someone from your group discussion upload the paper you just filled out about the ecological context model, upload that to Compass. If you'll go in the week 1 folder, you'll find an upload spot. So just one person from your group needs to upload that. So to summarize, theories have evolved over time, reflecting our deepened understanding of human development in context. There's a lot of different theories we're going to go over this semester, and a lot of it is different perspectives where someone said, I think this is how we develop, and wait, I think this is how we develop. And that's just the same for all of this stuff, and it will continue throughout the semester. We see that, personality is pretty stable. There is evidence that personality traits you had when you were younger are still present when you're older, but these are shaped by your experiences and your environment. So they do have a role to play. All right, and generally we're probably a product of both our genes and our environment, as well as the interaction between the two. All right, so those are our conclusions today. Now, before we go, we have a couple important things. One, Are there any questions at all? What questions do you have? Okay, cool. So remember, sign up for your chosen presentation week by Monday. So again, you'll find in the group presentation folder a sign up sheet for the group presentation. And then the other thing I want to do last is Sanchari and I are really considering how to make this class the most adaptive for you guys this semester. So we're talking about what this should look like, what this structure should look like. And I have a poll really quick for you guys where one of the things we've questioned is, would it be better to have synchronous, asynchronous classes, or a mix of both? And we wanted to take your guys' thoughts on this into consideration when we're having this discussion. So really quick, please take this poll. Okay, we've got a few more coming in. Yeah, we're almost got everybody. Okay, awesome. Thank you so much. We'll definitely take that into consideration. Other than that, have a great first week. I hope that it goes as smoothly as it can. I know, again, this is a very, very crazy time, so I hope that all goes well and the testing lines shorten significantly. So yeah, have a great week, guys, and I'll see you next week, okay? Bye.
I have a quick question.
Yeah, of course. I can't see you. I'm trying to.
Oh, that's okay. It's Maria. So for the optional readings, you said that there's one in week 5 or something that we have to read, but the book isn't required. So I'm just wondering, when you do give us weekly readings, if it says optional, like, should we read those for the exams?
So you don't have to read the optional readings for the exam. Yeah, definitely not. There's one where, so one of your optional textbooks is the social animal book. Mm-hmm. And one of those chapters is a required reading. So in that case, you have to read it.
And then for like, how in depth do you think that we should go? Like skim it, or like actually read it, like take notes and annotate it?
I would go in between those two.
Okay.
I don't think you have to do a crazy detailed reading because we go over it in class. And when we assess the readings, it's more like general. We want to make sure you read and comprehended.
Okay.
But yeah, you don't need to take detailed notes, but I wouldn't just skim it.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Have a good week.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I have a question too.
Yeah. Hi, Alejandro, right?
Yeah.
Hi.
I typed it in, but I don't know if you saw it because all the other messages came up. But how do we sign up? Do we just comment a time that works, or?
Yeah. So you go and it's a wiki, which I've never used before. But you go and you press edit content, and then you just put your name in one of the lines where you want to sign up, and then you put your email.
Okay, because I press like edit and like nothing happens.
Oh, if you look at the far left of your screen, there might be 2. Do we have to sign up with the group on Wiki? Oh, sorry, I sent that to the wrong person. But yeah, so if you look at the far left that says sign up, right?
Yeah.
Does it say sign up twice?
No, it's just once.
That's weird. Let me close the presentation really quick. 1 second, sorry.
You good?
Basically, I'm having this weird issue where Compass will only let me log on another website, on another computer, totally different device.